you to our panelists. It was nice to hear the emphasis on primary prevention and evidence to come, and disconcerting to hear about the budget constraints in terms of cutting funding for important programs. At this time, I'm going to open it to questions from the audience for our panelists. I'll start with the first question. Speaking about, Dr. Bradshaw talked about multi-component studies, and I would just like you to expand on that, if you will. What do you think are the most important components that should be included in a multi-component study?
Well, based on the work of the Tofty report, there was evidence that programs that provide training to classroom teachers around classroom management and what to do in bullying situations sounds like a no-brainer, but there are programs that don't actually provide any training to teachers, that they really just focus on students or other groups. But I would argue that teachers are an important piece of this puzzle. They are not the sole individuals, but ones that are really important. Similarly, parents, a lot of schools try to do programs or argue that parents don't want to be involved or can't be involved. And while parent engagement is a clear challenge for nearly all schools that I'm aware of, the parent communication and the school-home communication is particularly important. And youth activities. And so what are the youth and what are they doing? What strategies are they learning, whether it's around emotional regulation and communication, conflict resolution, or the more proximal programs that focus on what do you do when you're bullied, who do you go to, and those kinds of strategies. And then the other piece of this is the multi-component in the sense that there's a continuum. So what happens after you've been involved in bullying? What are we doing that's not punitive and reactive, like just kicking kids out or putting them in some kind of in-school suspension, but actually have a continuum of positively oriented activities for them to learn replacement skills and not just get punished for the problem behavior.
Good points. Other questions?
So, hi, Ellen Selke from University of Washington again. So I have two separate questions. So the first one is, Dr. Bradshaw, you had mentioned that the programs, that in the meta-analyses, the programs in Europe have been more effective, that the studies have shown more of an effect than in the United States. And I'm wondering why you think that is. Is it a methods problem in the study, or is it a cultural difference with our programs here? And which would, you know, is our entire culture of aggression in this country like a barrier to bullying prevention? The second question that I have is about the school-based programs and the role of school-based programs in preventing cyberbullying. I'm thinking specifically of a study that came out of the Kiva group where students who felt that their teachers had more ability to intervene with traditional bullying were more likely to cyberbully. So I'm wondering how you feel the school's role plays into cyberbullying prevention, if at all. Thanks.
Well, thanks for your very thoughtful questions. In terms of why are some of the programs more effective or seemingly more effective in Europe than they were here in the United States, I think there are a number of reasons. Dewey actually got into some of these when he rattled off reasons why schools in the United States don't really use a lot of the programs or the evidence-based programs. So a lot of our emphasis on testing and the high-stakes accountability for schools often put really tight constraints on how they spend their time. And while there are levels of accountability in our colleagues in Europe, but they're much higher in the United States, and so there tends to be a lot more pushback. So that's more of a procedural and kind of policy aspect about how we operate our schools and our focus on testing rather than a more holistic approach to learning. But then I also do think that there are truly cultural differences about our society and the role of violence within our society and the levels of exposure to violence that kids have in terms of the media and the norms around violence that we have within the United States. And I hate to kind of lump together the United States versus Europe, because there are also many of the studies that have been done in the United States have largely happened in suburban communities and not as much in our urban settings. There are, when you look more broadly at the violence prevention set of programs, many of those programs were conducted in more urban or urban fringe communities. So we can certainly borrow those models. but a lot of the bullying prevention programs have been conducted in more suburban communities. And thus, even within the United States, there's considerable cultural variation in terms of norms. For example, when we do some of our programming in Baltimore City, they don't even really like using the word bullying because that's what white kids in the suburbs are doing. What the kids in these communities are, they're getting banked, they're getting shanked, there are other terms that they use. So we really have to adapt our language. Another challenge with some of the models are cultural norms about reporting. In Baltimore City, you don't want to be a snitch, and a lot of the bullying prevention programs are about reporting. And so you get into cultural differences, even within the United States, that really go against some of these models and norms that are attempted to be implemented through some of the programs in the United States. So that's where the issue of cultural adaptation is critical, and we need to work with our community partners to be able to figure out adaptation that is strategic and appropriate, and not just say poor implementation is an excuse for adaptation. So we have to make sure that we're thinking culturally and contextually about when we take models not only from Europe, but even within the United States. What might work in a suburban community may not work very well in inner city Chicago or DC or Baltimore. In terms of the cyberbullying piece, I'll just kind of wrap up with this, and then it sounds like some other folks have some comments as well. You know, that's kind of a question that I have is, do we need a program for every single form of bullying? I have a good friend and colleague, Steve Leff, who does work on relational aggression, and he has a particular model that he's been developing looking specifically at relational aggression, and has actually done a really elegant set of activities to make it culturally and contextually relevant for urban African-American youth around the issue of relational aggression. And so Steve and I have a lovely conversation about, is that the narrow band kind of program relative to some of these whole school that try to hit a wider range of activities. And I think a similar thing comes up around cyberbullying. Is that a boutique kind of program? Do we need a special program that says cyber is totally different? I don't actually think so, because I think there's certainly some unique aspects about cyberbullying. We know, for example, kids are much more likely to just send a nasty email and cyberbully than they would actually say that face-to-face. Cyberbullying is much less prevalent when kids are getting into cyberbullying. It tends to be that they've had other forms of bullying that have already occurred, so you get much more quickly into this co-occurrence of multiple forms of cyberbullying. In fact, when we've done our analyses looking at IRT, item response theory, by the time kids are getting cyberbullied, they generally have had so many other forms of bullying at that point. It's a very hard item to actually endorse when you give a whole range of different assessments. So I think there are some unique things about bullying, but when you think about empathy training and skill development, I think that there are ways that we can try to address the cyber context within bullying prevention more broadly. I do think schools are very troubled by it. In many ways, it's complex. It involves a whole other set of rules. They don't really know, do I have to be bothered by this? But most schools, and Dewey can certainly elaborate on this, most of the federal guidelines and the policies in the states are saying if it creates a disruption in the learning environment, it's your problem, even if the email came from a device that isn't school-owned or if it came from an off-site email account. If it's creating a disruption in the school environment, it becomes your responsibility to manage.
Did the other panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to just add on the first issue about differences between European programs and ours. Another possible explanation is about the quality of implementation of programs, and I haven't seen any studies comparing quality of implementation in Europe and U.S., but I have looked at the quality of implementation for programs in general in U.S. schools in that national study that I talked about in my presentation. We collected information about the number of different programs schools are implementing and the quality of implementation of those programs, and we were astounded to see that the average school is implementing 17 different programs at the same time. And when we looked at the quality indicators, they were very extremely low quality implementation. We have a panel tomorrow, thankfully, that's going to focus on this implementation issue. But I think that is one possible reason why we see differences in the U.S.
Other questions? Do we have any questions from the web? Yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Katzenbuehler from Columbia. Thanks again to all of you for another great panel. My question was actually to Catherine on the meta-analysis. And I was, given the sort of range of effect size and mixed findings, it always, to my mind, immediately jumps to questions of contextual moderators. And I was thinking about, in some other unrelated areas, some new studies that have pulled together HIV prevention studies, and one recent one looking at condom use among African Americans. And when they pulled all the studies together, they had large enough variation in terms of geographics where they were able to link that to data on the level of prejudice in the area. They linked it to black-white attitudes and showed basically no intervention effectiveness in high prejudice areas, but very strong intervention effectiveness in low prejudice areas. And that just made me think about potential moderators to look at in the anti-bullying policy or program case, to think about things like, for instance, whether or not the school district or the state has an anti-bullying policy, or maybe SES differences in terms of resources. But I'm just curious if you can start to link in some of those contextual moderators to maybe understand why some of these programs are differentially more or less effective in certain areas, and perhaps other moderators that could be looked at as well.
Certainly that's a goal of a lot of the meta-analyses, is to try to ferret out what might be contextual or psychological effect moderators. The study designs do vary considerably as to what they actually have, so quite often you get into demographic kind of contrast rather than the more process or psychological contrast that you were highlighting. So for example, some of the findings that came out of the Tofty study indicated, as I had suggested, that the effects were actually a little bit stronger for the middle adolescent group relative to the younger kids, variation by design and other characteristics. So those were the kind of moderators that they looked at, rather than looking at the more process-oriented ones that you were looking at. There are some opportunities potentially to look at gender differences as well as socioeconomic, but quite often the samples, other than gender, they typically are pretty well balanced on gender, but they vary considerably around ethnic factors and socioeconomic factors to really be able to ferret that out. And in the kind of summary that we did of the meta-analyses, the 6 that actually pulls, and I just gave you one snapshot of the 6-page table that puts all the studies side by side and goes into things, for example, like conflict of interest and cost-benefit analysis and other kinds of file drawer types of issues. Are there studies that might be not actually published, other language kind of issues. So we got into that from a more methodological standpoint rather than a particular moderator for does this. And I think it's just because of the paucity of studies. Even in the largest one, the Tofty study, which was the most liberal, I would say, because they did use studies that were in other languages, for example, in other countries. But that they all had to be rigorous. There were only 53, so you don't really have a lot of power to be able to examine in a very sophisticated framework a lot of more psychological type of moderators.
I guess I was thinking less about factors that have been included in the study itself, but linking in external factors. So thinking about the state where that study was conducted and whether or not it has an anti-bullying policy, or how the strength or how elaborate that anti-bullying policy was, and that might be the moderator. So you could link in external data sources to look at moderators in that way, not actual things included in the study.
Yeah, I think that more macro level of analysis usually isn't quite feasible, again, because of small sample sizes. Many were conducted within the same state, or even if they did pull across different states. The laws and policies that Dewey talked about have been more recent. And there's also a lot of change in those in the way more recent in terms of, since pretty much Columbine, 1999, I believe it was the first rollout in Georgia. Ironically, that was already on the docket, I think, before Columbine hit. So they've varied in terms of the policies and the rollout. So be able to examine that contextually is probably more of a qualitative And usually that ends up in the discussion section of why this study didn't work out. Maybe it's because of this, maybe it's because of that. So, but these are all really important things, and I didn't have a chance to really kind of go into where I think the next directions are as we talk about other models around social marketing campaigns, or really trying to get a handle on the effectiveness or impact of any of these policies and the extent to which they're implemented. So in Maryland, where we've had a policy for a number of years, which essentially is a mandated reporting process, when we've done statewide assessments of and surveys of teachers, we find that about half of the teachers are even aware of the process to do it, to implement it, and a relatively small number have actually even written down a formal process and recording it. So having a policy is very different than its actual implementation, and we don't even know if the policies really are all that effective. So.
Good point. Next question.
You were standing. No, go.
My question involves schools and funding. Like you were saying, 6,000 years before a shooting would occur. How's the best way to pair the security issue along with the bullying prevention? Can you pair those up, and what's the best strategy to get funding for these schools who want to do both and convince school boards to be willing to fund this?
Good question. And I think bullying is prevention of school shootings and other types of serious acts of violence. It's more in the way of primary or secondary prevention. And we need to shift schools away from thinking about security as the first line of a defense against a school shooting or other serious act of violence, to thinking about prior prevention issues, mental health services in schools, threat assessment, bully prevention programs that identify problems or concerns among students before they're at the point of lethality.
Thank you.
I don't have a question. I just want to make sure America's not confused. The Tofty and Farrington meta-analysis was a between-study analysis, moderator analysis. What we did was a hierarchical meta-analysis where we did within study, so as opposed to aggregating younger and older. We looked at that separately and found that by 8th grade, the effect sizes were 0 and in high school negative. So I just want to make sure that we improved on that. That was a methodological flaw. We love the Tofty and Farrington, and I use it in so many ways, but it did include a methodological flaw that we've improved upon. So I just want to make sure so older kids, we need to be thinking developmentally differently.
Thank you for that. We have another question.
Hi, I'm a mediator. I work in the schools with a youth restorative justice initiative, and that comes from a conflict resolution center, and each county in Maryland has a free conflict resolution center that offers free confidential mediations to people in the community who need it. So we work with student-to-student issues, also student-to-teachers. Sometimes teachers request this, and we're very much welcomed and appreciated by the principals of the schools, the counseling office, the security. They're very behind us, and we have evidence of the effectiveness of the program, that a lot of research and data is constantly being taken, and Community Mediation Maryland is one of the organizations doing a lot of the research and showing that it's reducing tremendously the number of suspensions in the schools and, certain incidents. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think it could be effective to have more of an institutional change in having groups like either outside mediators? In Maryland, it's easy because you can easily partner with a community mediation center in each county whose an object is to help in the school, to help all the community. But in other schools, to have as part of either the counseling office or somewhere at the school, someone with expertise in conflict management, because a lot of bullying does relate to conflict, and it's not just intervention after the fact, it's prevention. So it's kind of a program that involves both. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on those sorts of conflict management programs as interventions to help in bullying.
So I think it's really important for schools to have a lot of tools in their toolkit to be able to address a wide range of problems that come up. And when we were first starting off talking about the difference between a conflict and bullying, I think that that might be one of our early signs where we start thinking, all right, well, what tools can we use to address the issues of conflict or fights or disagreements that happen? And then we might need to think about some of those same tools might apply for a bullying situation, but we might also want to think a little bit more about some of the assumptions that we make of programs that we're using for a conflict that may not carry over to a bullying situation. So for example, a lot of kids that are victimized by their peers, they don't want to sit across the table and talk with them, even in a very structured and well-intended environment. And so we have to be a little bit cautious about that, and I imagine your team is really thoughtful about the approaches that you use around that. So that's one area that we really need to think about. Are there strategies or times which we might use? And for example, let's say there's a disagreement between kids and it becomes like, even though they were good friends, and then it becomes a bit of a bullying situation. That might be a situation, if it's well structured, that you could be able to use a conflict management type of approach or a peer mediation. But if there's a really bad history and a long entrenched cycle, I'm thinking a little bit about Tracy Valancourt's comments about, we can't really tell which kids are going to respond to which kind of strategies, or kids that are going to have histories of trauma, that even sitting across from the perpetrator might further damage them in some ways. So that's one reason why we're a little cautious about some of those. I think restorative practices are a little bit of a derivation of that, because it comes from a long history of work in the justice setting about, can we have ways that kids can make up for transgressions that they've had. And there's been some positive results in other settings, particularly for property kind of offenses or offenses against adults. As we start thinking about bullying situations, that's another context where you think, well, maybe they can kind of restore the wrongdoings within that relationship, especially if the victim is comfortable coming face to face and working through that. But the idea of working through it somewhat suggests that it's a disagreement or a conflict, and it may be a situation that we need to think about a different strategy. There really hasn't been a lot of large-scale rigorous research going on around restorative practices, so I and a number of colleagues that I work with, I know you work a lot with Ann Gregory, and she's been doing some work, very nice and elegant work at a more prevention framework. I've spent some time talking with her about that and her colleagues. I think we need a little bit more of a body of research to be able to articulate with those models. I'm familiar a little bit with some of the models in Maryland, having been in Maryland for a number of years. But I think we really need to kind of grow that research base about these are what the models are, and do the more systematic research. I know I was at a couple of meetings around with a district that was getting ready to launch those approaches, and in Maryland, in fact, and so they were talking about the number of cases that actually didn't come to a community setting, and so you start wondering, well, how many of those you don't have kids that are coming together? So I think that's where we really need to have a more formal process and larger studies that use a random assignment type of design for us to really be able to make conclusions about that. So I think there's promise there. I'm excited about that. I like the ideas and the concepts. I think some of the work Ann Gregory's doing is really very promising. I just don't want to put the cart before the horse and say that this is the one strategy folks should be using.
We're just about out of time, so we have time for just one quick question or comment.
Hi, Jonathan Tadros from Georgia State University and on the Planning Committee, though this is not from the Planning Committee. This is a question in my individual capacity. So the quick question is, it's for the entire panel, but it's rooted in one of the slides that Catherine showed that suggested that a high level of playground supervision is necessary. That reminded me of the research in the area of play, which suggests that the high level of supervision and lack of unstructured play is inhibiting the development of conflict resolution skills, and actually might inhibit the development of other regarding behavior. Because if you don't have the experience of others walking away when you don't play nice, you never really learn to think about others. So I'm just wondering then, that to me suggests a tough question for schools, and so I pose it to you. What does the evidence say about what's the right extent of intervention and supervision from schools? To end with an easy question.
I think it comes back to a lot of supervision and management. I cited some work of Steve Leff earlier, and he's at a University of Pennsylvania, the Children's Hospital there. He and his colleagues have developed a really nice model for training paraprofessionals how to supervise playground environments and similarly how to supervise cafeterias, and they're working largely with paraprofessionals in that setting that may not have had a long history of training in classroom management. So I think those settings are incredibly important, especially as we think about the rising rates of obesity and low exercise that a lot of our kids are getting. It becomes very sad when schools start eliminating recess either because of demands on academic time or concerns about discipline problems in those settings. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to have in a kind of a zone of proximal development. You need to be able to resolve the little day-to-day conflicts that happen as practice for how to go through those. So those basic interactions, and that's part of the rough and tumble play, and as a developmentalist, we think you've got to start small, so that way when it does get big, you have some kind of skill set to draw upon. So I agree with you that having those settings that aren't overly managed and micromanaged by the adults, but are adequately supervised, are really important for creating opportunities for kids to learn how to regulate their emotions, communicate their problems. In fact, the social emotional learning curricula aren't about totally putting a damper pedal on any kind of problems. They're using those teachable moments and giving kids strategies and skills, learning how to label their own emotions and being able to try strategies. So for example, in the PATHS curriculum, they use a technique called the turtle technique, where they train kids when they're starting to get worked up that they can actually pull back like a turtle does into its shell and kind of take their own time out rather than being sent to a timeout. And it provides them an opportunity to regroup, label the problem, and come back and rejoin the group. If you don't have those opportunities for that in exchange, you can't begin to develop that skill and practice that.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you for your excellent thoughts and comments.